She's having when she's standing up. She's going to take it off. Oh, of course.
Hello. So hello everybody and welcome to Four Corners, the 4K Speaker Series event today. So local historian and author Joseph Graham will be presenting his new book, Insatiable Hunger. I want to thank you all for coming in person, and I want to thank everybody on Zoom also who is joining us today. I want to thank Joseph for doing this today, and for Sheila as well for helping out in this presentation. I want to thank the Trinity Church and John Richard for all the help that they've given us to prepare this. I also want to thank Sabina Allery, who is my daughter here today, and my volunteer who is also helping out. I won't talk that much because I'm sure you're not here to hear me, but I would like to have everybody to acknowledge the land. So we would like to ask everyone to take a moment to remember that we are on unceded land of the Wescarenes, a part of the Algonquin Nation, and the Mohawk of the Haudenosaunee Confederation. And with this, I will give it on to Sheila. Enjoy the presentation.
Thank you, Chloe. Is that on?
No.
No. Now is it? Okay, the bottom falls out. So can you well, I'd like to acknowledge one more thing here just before we get started, and that's that Joe and I did our first dog and pony show of this nature in this very room almost 30 years ago. And it's been going on. We hope we entertain you and that you learn something from this presentation. So, but I'd like to start, Joe, with asking you to explain why we do these land acknowledgements here, what it means, what it's about.
Yeah, the land acknowledgements, we're seeing them more and more frequently, and often I think, look, is it appropriate? Why are we doing it? So maybe a little bit of background is important. We are on territory that was never, it's unceded Wescarene territory in the sense that, and Mohawk, in the sense that there was never any agreement, formal agreement for the Euro-descended colonists to move to this area. I don't know, there's probably people are aware of that, but I was thinking I might read to you a little bit in the book that something that describes that aspect of it. Back after the American War of Independence, this is a fairly recent example, the British government did what they call the Proclamation of 1763, which defined Indigenous land as being west of the line and European descendant land being east. It was to try to control the people from exploding into the Indigenous land. This worked as long as it was respected, but the population of the European descendant people was exploding, and also their sense of entitlement was very, very strong. People, after the War of Independence, people were coming north, not wanting to stay in the new country of the United States. And Upper Canada was mostly subject to the proclamation. But there's another aspect to this, and that is that the ethical values of Indigenous people are to share, and it's so deeply in their way of thinking that there was no question of not sharing. They didn't own, it wasn't a property issue. Is there too much feedback? No. Okay, that's fine. Okay. So I'll read this little piece. In Upper Canada, many of the new citizens were people who had fled the 13 colonies because of their deeper loyalty to the British Crown. They crowded into locations beyond the Proclamation of 1763, quote, welcomed through treaties by the Mississauga and a few chiefs of other nations. The intention of these treaties from an Indigenous perspective was driven by an obligation to share, something that was fundamental humanitarian concept among most Indigenous people. The quote payment made for this openness involved trifling articles such as clothes for their families, some guns and ammunition, 12 lace hats, and enough red cloth to make 12 coats. Items accepted, no doubt, with grace. Most of the proclamation territory was shared through numerous treaties. The colonists filled the space as though it had been unpeopled before, as if the treaty was an acknowledgement made by the Indigenous peoples that the territory was no longer theirs, as if they had simply ceased to exist. Confronted with a new legal code, the Indigenous codes and national status lost effect as the Indigenous people became overwhelmed by newcomers and their diseases.
So what was the clash of the two? How did it play out, the clash of the two cultures, the Europeans and the Indigenous people here?
You're practically leading me to read something else. I don't know if that was your intention.
No, not really.
But the clash was two entirely different civilizations, two entirely different value systems. And in the Americas, the value system, since there was no concept of ownership, this was a foreign system. So the idea that sharing was fundamental can be better understood. The European and Asian world was based on ownership, hierarchy, property. Hierarchy in the Americas was practically flat. There wasn't really a hierarchy in the same way. Does that answer for now? And then,
Yeah, can you explain the hierarchy? Europeans and the lack of hierarchy here, where did that come from?
okay, this is something that was really interesting, and I have to say, in doing the research for this book, which took me a very long time. When I started, there was no Truth and Reconciliation Commission. My objective was to try to understand what happened in the Laurentians before the colonists came, because I couldn't find that history. But to answer Sheila's question more immediately, the hierarchies seem to have formed through the male-dominant culture, which was not the case here. This case was a gender-balanced culture. There was no male dominance. Men and women had played different roles, yes, but they didn't have any kind of even a hierarchy of that type. In fact, their understanding was that every creature, every tree, and every spirit was an elder sibling, and they were in a family in which they were the youngest siblings. As a result, they had to learn from their eldest siblings. And since they had the capacity to dream, basically, and to understand, they also felt duty bound to make sure that remained shared.
But in Europe, it was quite different, and the hierarchy developed out of what?
Yeah, well, the source that I found that helped me understand the hierarchy was Anki Becker wrote. She was a Harvard professor, I guess. She wrote a paper called "Herding and Male Dominance," and it described how herding led to the dominant male culture. In her perspective, there are lots of other theories, but there's a couple of important things here. One is that it wasn't natural. It wasn't part of our genetic makeup. It was something that happened at some point in our social evolution. So if it happened, then she was tying it to herding. And I thought, well, isn't that interesting? So I looked at her maps quickly in her studies and realized how valuable this was to me, because it demonstrated that the Americas had virtually no herding. Herding was not here. The herding was basically a characteristic of Europe and Asia, peripheral Africa, and not even Central Africa, and not Australia. So then what we see is those people who had no herding were completely incomprehending of this hierarchical society.
And how did that play out here? What happened here when the herding peoples came to the more, the ones who didn't have that relationship with animals?
Okay, look, the herding people, actually, the herding led to hierarchy, led to organized religion, led all the way to the point where we had a Catholic Europe, and Catholic Europe was suffering from the Reformation around the time that these people began to look for religious freedom by moving to other places. And so that is pretty key, because these people were coming here with a concept of finding a safe place for themselves in their religion, and they didn't want people in the way. So the people here were just in the way.
And so the Europeans came with a plan to populate the place, to expand out of Europe and turn it into another Europe.
Well, one of the things that's really interesting is a study of Quebec, of New France, because New France had a different problem. It was different from England and different from Holland, which is the three that we're going to sort of briefly touch upon, or do in the book. The French Huguenots, Protestants, had been trying to set up communities to protect their religious freedom, and Quebec was the fourth tribe.
Where did the Huguenots come from?
Just to quickly say that the hierarchy in Europe was dominated by the Catholic Church at that time, and one of the things to keep in mind in trying to understand what that means is the Catholic Church was a service provider. Forget about the religion for a minute. Their job was to provide health, social services, registry of birth and deaths, and education. A huge part of what provincial governments provide in Canada today. So they had a huge stake in society, and they were very convenient to the rulers who depended upon them to keep social organization. So you have a situation where the church has incredible power. At the beginning of the Reformation, for instance, when France and Germany began differently to try to fight back and take some of that power from the church, the Catholic Church owned 50% of Germany, of the German states. You can get an idea there.
And so they were very wealthy, and the people rose up against that and created Protestantism.
Basically, that's in a nutshell, yes. And the problem is that caused civil war. It caused civil war in France, and it caused a lot of war in Europe for a very long time.
And that displaced the people, and people looking for refuge were then the impetus for coming to America.
Yes, except for the French. The French, what happened is they so completely suppressed their Huguenot population that Cardinal Richelieu, who was the prime minister for King Louis XIII, and the immediate power following King Henry IV, who was called the Bon Roi Henri, who tried to make religious freedom in France. This man, the King Henry, was assassinated, and when Cardinal Richelieu took over, he announced that New France would be Catholic only. So it became the most Catholic place in the French sphere of influence.
Even though it began as a Protestant, and the French Protestants being called Huguenots.
Yeah, and Champlain was the man looking after the colony. He had been hired by the Protestants to do it, but he had to choose between the colony and Protestantism. He chose the colony, and what he presented back into the French government was the idea that he could find people by converting people to Catholicism, just in the same way as Catholicism moved into France and Germany in the first place a long time before. So that was the modus operandi. The idea was to convert the people here to Catholicism.
And what were the first experiences of the people who came over when they encountered this land that had its own civilization?
What they felt was that the people, like the Innu, the Montagnais that lived along the St. Lawrence River, were just would be too difficult to bring into the church. They needed to find sedentary people. And the people that are remembered as the Huron, the Huron Wendat, who were situated between Lake Simcoe and the Georgian Bay, were actually a large agricultural civilization that had an incredible amount of exchange, interaction with all of the Algonquian people around it. It was Iroquois and had a lot of action interchange with the Algonquian people, so it became the breadbasket. But it was also promising in terms of being able to convert. One of the things that Champlain and the Recollets did when they wanted to get going is that they actually conceived the first residential school. The concept of taking the children into the school and keeping them away from their own influences to try to make them into Catholics by making sure that that's what their experience was.
When was that?
I mean, Champlain died in 1636. So this was in the 1620s, basically.
Well, the first residential school was in the 1620s.
It wasn't a residential school as the ones we learned about later, and it wasn't a successful experiment in the sense that the Indigenous people really weren't going to be part of it. But the concept was there, and so what they did is they sent religious people to the Wendat country, what Champlain called the Huron. The Huron is not a very polite term, so they generally is preferable to use their term, which is Wendat. In going there, they tried to establish a Catholic colony by offering to trade guns and European products with those who declared themselves to be Catholic. And so ultimately what they did is they took this, what was the absolutely strongest European Iroquois center around the Great Lakes and broke it in two between those who accepted to be Catholic and those who refused to remain traditional.
I'd like to go back a few steps because we've gone farther forward and talk about the first encounters between the Europeans and what they found here.
Well, actually, there's one of the things, the readings that I could show that describes very well that, and it's very early in the book. So why don't I try to read that? This is back at the time of the Reading of
Just the mic's maybe further away because it's echoing.
Okay, but maybe just turn the volume down a bit. How is that? Is that better now? Is there less echoing? Yeah. Can you hear it, Vic? I think it's the ceiling. Oh, yeah, well, is there less echoing now? No. Okay, I'll try to. Is that better? Can you hear me? All right. Can you hear me in the back? Yeah. Okay, so I'll just do it a little further away because it sounded funny to me as well.
It's more online that they're.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So Jacques Cartier is 1535. And he's arrived in the Gaspé area in the Maritime, and he has a few initial almost encounters with Indigenous people, and finally he tries shooing them away, shooting a cannon off over their heads. But there's nothing that he can do. These people want to meet him, and they're a little bit more aggressive than he had anticipated they would be, in a very friendly way. So I'll do a reading for the two short parts of when they first met. The next day, the canoeists returned to where Cartier's people had withdrawn. They kept a respectable distance, but indicated again their good intentions. This time, two Frenchmen were sent to approach them with gifts of hatchets and other iron tools, as well as a bright red cap. Soon the people were dancing around them, doing handstands on the water's edge, and expressing their joy. By the time the meeting was finished, the hosts left in great happiness, stark naked, having traded everything they had for treasures of iron and other small European items. They indicated they would return soon with more goods to exchange. This whole happy occasion repeated itself a few days later when Cartier used small boats to explore the Bay de Chaleur. On this second visit, the people, a different group with greater marketing skills, placed cooked seal meat on boards, indicating their guests should eat, and withdrew. There were around 300 of them, men, women, and children. Once the French were comfortable that they would not be hurt, their hosts approached them, dancing and singing, rubbing the crew's arms affectionately, and showing other signs of reassurance. Again, by the time the exchange was over, they left naked and happy, carrying pots, trinkets, and metal tools. Cartier noted, as he had done before, that the products he had received were of little value, but added that these people could be easily converted to the Catholic faith. Cartier and his crew had touched the rim of a large civilization that had no need for the Catholic faith. They had their own beliefs, and they had given value for what they received, satisfied no doubt that the exchange had been fair. They were a part of a culture that saw giving as a form of expression and received in the same spirit, a society where their measure was the stature achieved through sharing. Does that help?
So why did the relationship go downhill from there?
Well, it's really interesting. Almost every interaction went downhill. It started off initially like this and ended up in basically bloodshed. And part of the reason was that the indigenous people could not comprehend, these new people could not understand the concept of sharing. It was so focused in them that they couldn't get their minds around it. So before they knew it, these people were taking a lot.
Is that the difference between the market economy and the sharing culture? That was a real clash between these two worldviews.
Yeah, the market economy is property driven. What you own is your stature. Your importance is based on your wealth. And in the indigenous culture, like one of the Dutch had said when he saw a Mohawk chief in his village in New York, said, "It's incomprehensible. He is the chief, but he's clearly the poorest and worst off of all of them." And this is one of the reasons that he had been chosen to be a chief, because he understood that needs of the community had to be fulfilled before his own.
You mentioned now the Dutch, and we know about the English being here in the French. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between the relationships with the three different European groups of colonists?
Yes, we talked about the Dutch, the French, in terms of how they did not have people to colonize to any great extent and had to look for another solution. The Dutch had no desire to colonize. Their primary desire was to trade. And they traded in a very European fashion. I think this is worth that and bargained. The Mohawk were the ones who they met, and the Mohawk watched and learned very quickly how the Dutch thought and realized that it was entirely different from their own way of thinking. So they said that they would continue to work with them, but they should sign an agreement first. And the agreement they called the two-row wampum. I'm sure that this is a familiar term. The two-row wampum was an agreement that they would travel together in parallel, but always respecting that each other was different and that they would respect each other's differences. Since the Dutch had no real territorial desire other than what they needed for trade, the Dutch had no problem with that agreement.
But did it hold? We don't hear, we know New Amsterdam and how Manhattan was sold Dutch for a trivial amount. It doesn't seem like the Dutch way of dealing with the indigenous people carried through.
Well, it didn't, because they had to have a base, and New Amsterdam was their base. They were doing a lot of trading. They had to have their ships come in. They were like other European countries. They were capturing slaves and selling them. So they were still European culture. But the Dutch was in rebellion against Spain in Europe. And so you have all of these different things happening in Europe that were affecting what happened here. And this is what I found really crucial to understand. The Dutch were helped by the Huguenots. They were helped by the English, and they helped. All the Protestant groups in Northern Europe helped each other protect themselves. But the Dutch did not have the same population needs, and as a result, it was the English who would ultimately dominate, because their system was to basically let the dissidents go, let them leave. And so when I guess it was Charles II came in as king after Oliver Cromwell's period, the Puritans realized they couldn't stay, they had to get out. The Anglican Church was dominant, it wasn't tolerating other Protestant religions, and a huge population of them arrived in New England. Now, now I should just mention that in New England before that, there was the very wonderful mythology, wonderful American story of the Pilgrims arriving
on the Mayflower at Plymouth Rock.
that was Civil War. On the Mayflower at the Plymouth Rock.
It's a completely different story from the French, from the Dutch, to the way the English came.
Yeah, and the Mayflower was actually the dominant group of people on it were English and Dutch people from Leiden in Holland, and they had Dutch Dutch understandings about how things were working, and they actually got along very well with the Wampanoag whom they met. Basically they became allies, and they worked together.
And then the Puritans arrived.
And then the Puritans arrived. The Puritans arrived further north. When they arrived, instead of it being 2 shiploads, it was 30,000 people. And arrived over a fairly short period of time. It was a massive group of people who had no care for the fact that there was people in the way. They just pushed them out of the way.
And they arrived with animals and settled in with their diseases from the herding culture.
Exactly. Well, everyone brought the diseases of the herding culture. One of the stories is, going back to the Wampanoag for a second, was that an English trader whom the Wampanoag knew they had been trading, but they didn't know this particular captain. He saw an opportunity. He grabbed some Wampanoag men, forced them into the hold of a ship, and brought them to Spain and sold them as slaves. The Wampanoag blew up, just completely reacted to this by attacking any English colony, any anything that they could see. And they went on a wild rampage, killing these people, trying to get them off the territory. And the end of that story was that they all became infected with the diseases because of the close proximity. And villages were wiped out, most of them died off. So the Pilgrims found an empty village. It had just been abandoned. And after they were there a short time, one of its original people came back. He had been taken to Spain, he spoke English, he managed to get away, he got to Newfoundland, he was recognized, and then brought back to help the English get to know the people. And he went to his home village, found these people in it, and became their guide.
There were a lot of stories of Europeans coming and becoming interpreters, or Indigenous people more forcibly being taken back to Europe to learn European ways. Can you, I think that was particularly among the French.
Yes, the French, that's the other side of Champlain, because the thing that one must remember in reading about anyone's history is everyone is good. At least everyone sees themselves as being very good. And circumstances make them look different over time. But Champlain really wanted to grow with these people and get to know them. And he actually had one of his own people come forward and say, I would like to stay with them. So they made an arrangement, and it turns out that the Wendat and all the European people had a tradition of doing this, where they said, he can stay with you.
All the indigenous people,
What did I say?
European.
Sorry. Hope you guys can follow me. Maybe you better just read the book. The Iroquois people had a tradition, if there was a situation like that, of trading an individual. In other words, they would give one of their sons and take one of the sons of the other people for a year or a period of time, learn each other's languages and get to know each other that way. So that Champlain did that with Etienne Brule and Sauvignon. Sauvignon was the son of a Wendat chief, and one learned the Wendat language and one learned French.
And the Europeans often wanted to stay.
Yes, well, that was another aspect. When there was a skirmish, what the French found is that if people were taken prisoner by the Iroquois, whether it was the Mohawk or whichever one they often didn't want to go back. They liked it better there. The women had more rights. They didn't want to be returned. The men had more freedom, so often they just didn't want to leave.
And there are some interesting stories that you tell of that kind of thing, but also of the opposite side of that, of the people being forcibly removed from the indigenous cultures, and that didn't happen the other way, except in times of war. And we hear about, like if you read the Joseph Boyden's The Orenda, the horrible tortures that were visited upon the prisoners.
Yeah, I don't know. I imagine a lot of people here have read Joseph Boyden's book. He describes the tortures in Iroquois culture, and when I read that book, I'd already read about that. I had come across a book called The Children of Atensik, written by Bruce Trigger, which was the history of, he called it the history of the Huron people from up to 1650. And it took me 2 years to read. It was a course, it was huge. But in it, he describes these skirmishes, and the wars that they had were wars that were more of honor. They were pretty vicious wars all the same. I mean, not trying to paint anybody as perfect by any means. What they did is if there was a disagreement and they couldn't settle the disagreement, it was not likely to be over territory. It was likely to be out of honor, out of an unwillingness to share in condolence if someone had died or something like this. There was some terrible misunderstanding. And what they would do is they would fight to capture other warriors to replace the ones that had died in their own community. So you would have a warrior captured, be brought home and given to a family who had lost a warrior to those other people. And they had the right to do what they wanted to that person. So they wanted to make that person pay for what the murder he had done. And every young man learned his death song, the song he would sing to keep his strength if he was ever captured and was tortured. And that it was a matter of showing that he could take it. Ultimately, if they broke the man would become adopted and become part of their culture. If they couldn't break him, they would make sure that they had the courtesy to have him die at sunrise, because that was the correct time for someone so brave to die. And they would honor these people who were so brave.
There was also the adoption process, the genetic exchange.
Yeah, well, that's it. Where that's taking us is this: all societies cannot live in isolation. I have three grandchildren from vastly different cultures, and their parents could meet and interact and reproduce. They weren't separate, all the same race.
Separate species.
Such species, yeah. They were all the same. And each culture had developed its own way of sharing genetically. And in the Iroquoian way, this was the way those warriors became part of the community. It appears that the concept of rape that kind of violence just did not exist in those communities. And part of the reason was that the women were very, very highly respected. The general saying was a woman is worth two men. It's a totally different world than what we're used to. By contrast, in the European system, if you go back to those herding cultures for a moment, and you imagine these herding cultures protecting themselves, protecting their mobile asset, these animals out in the hills, they had to develop a fighting hierarchy because at first the danger may have been predators, but over time it became other groups of men who were protecting their own herds and wanted to expand them. And this meant that to a large degree, the women were left at base camp and were considered a liability and a problem. But the men were key, and they developed a hierarchy. And as a result, what happened is that women also became fair game to steal. And so I can imagine that probably what happened at one point is the men came home to the base camp and discovered there was no one there. They were either all killed or stolen. And this would have caused the birth of what we've come to call the rape culture. That shared its genes through a violent domination of the women and ownership of women.
That's a lovely picture.
Sorry.
To paint. Let's move to something more, some of the beauty of what was here and how the people supported themselves, their relationship to the world around them.
Yeah, one of the things that I found fascinating was to realize that from the Atlantic coast to the Great Lakes, it was principally a pine forest, a white pine forest. There's a tree chart from 1800 in Vermont that shows that the average white pine tree was 22 stories high and 6 feet in diameter. So you can imagine these things rival what you see out west today. And they considered themselves a woodland people, and the woods were there for them to protect and to live in. So that gives you perhaps a little bit of an idea of the beauty that they must have lived in. Everything was sacred. Absolutely everything was considered to be sacred. So if the religion was that they lived, they lived in the forest, they were a part of the forest.
And but farther south, it was more agricultural, farther south.
Well,
the west.
the Iroquoian people, what they would do is they learned about growing the three sisters, which is maize, squash, beans, which coexist very well. They actually complement each other. It's how we make our gardens at St. Lucie. We use the three sisters technique, and it makes a very good soil. It gets you going very well. But they would clear the forest. The men would clear the forest. They would use the logs to build the homes, the longhouses, and the women would farm the forest. And that forest would be farmed for 15 years. And then they would move and let it rest. And so
How long?
roughly 75 years. So that was, interestingly, among those other things that came from Europe, in this whole area, the Great Lakes area and the northern states, there were no earthworms. Earthworms are a European import. And women were absolutely horrified by these worms that started appearing in their soil.
Is there something else from, tell us a little bit about how you did the research for this, because you've gone back to before contact in many ways, and there were no written sources for that.
Yeah, well, actually, to start with, just a quick aside, when I was very young, I realized that there had to have been a time when there was not one God. The concept of a single God did not exist. So when I started discovering the indigenous culture did not have the concept of a single God, it was something that was foreign to them as well. It really piqued my interest. The Great Spirit is there now, and in a lot of ways it's there to accommodate this way of thinking. But what I did is I wrote Naming the Laurentians, and Naming the Laurentians had one chapter that talked about nominang, and it was 3. And I I felt that, okay, I already had enough knowledge to know that I'd better check that source. It was Serge Laurent who wrote the Histoire des Laurentians, who said that the Mohawks came in and killed all of the Wescarinese and they were extinct. Very convenient for the people living here that the people who were indigenous to here no longer existed. But I didn't have enough knowledge of the Algonquian way of thinking to be able to pose the questions and get an answer that I could understand. And I was frustrated. I just couldn't understand what I was being told. What I was being told was basically, figure it out yourself. So I said, okay, we had a date for the publishing. The book was published because the Argenteuil Museum asked us to check to make sure that they had all of the stories we had already written in the museum. He said, oh, this is crazy, we have to put it in the book. Once it got out as a book, I started getting feedback from the Indigenous people that I couldn't reach before. And this one woman who we know each other well today and really admire and respect each other, and she's very helpful to me, wrote me a really angry letter about how I was just spewing the white colonial stuff, and she has her own Wescarini roots to contradict me. Well, I had a lot to learn. And so I said, yeah, I got to keep digging. I have to keep learning about this. Simultaneously, it was serendipity for one. Oral history started going online. And I could read it right on my computer in my house. I also have a huge number of books that I was reading, and some of them are indigenous written books.
Yeah, and if you get the book, there's a huge bibliography and suggested reading to take you down a lot of these paths, because the book itself it ends at the War of 1812. This is the whole story of contact to that point. And there's really a lot to learn from it. But if you want to finish with your other reading.
Yeah, I just wanted to read one last thing. It shows to what extent the Indigenous people try to make things work. It's the Treaty of Lancaster, 1744, and the governor of Maryland is complaining to the 5 nations that they're meeting with, the 6 nations at that point, that they were not respecting some land agreement, that this land belongs to Maryland, and it didn't belong to them. And we have a saying that, think before you talk, pause before you answer. The Iroquoian pause before you answer, get a night's sleep, talk the next day, answer the question once you've slept on it. So the next day, they're back at their conference, and Chief Casatago, leader of the Onondaga, who are the principal nation of the 5 nations, 6 nations, answered. And he said, "Brother, Governor of Maryland, when you mentioned the affair of the land yesterday, you went back to old times and told us you had been in possession of the province of Maryland above 100 years. But what is 100 years in comparison to the length of time since our claim began, since we came of the ground? We must tell you that long before 100 years, our ancestors came out of this very ground, and their children have remained here ever since. You came out of the ground in a country that lies beyond the seas. There you may have a just claim, but here you must allow us to be your elder brother, and the lands to belong to us long before you know anything about them."
That really sounds like what we're hearing from the Indigenous nations now, hundreds of years later, still trying to get that same message across.
Yeah, absolutely.
I guess we can turn it over. Does anybody have any questions you'd like to ask?
Yes.
You mentioned at the beginning of, can you hear me through this thing? The line of demarcation under the Royal Proclamation of 1963 was the area in Upper Canada. Is it true that the area here was not ceded or subject to treaty obligations under the Royal Proclamation of 1963?
The concept of the proclamation originally was conceived to keep the 13 colonies from going west of a certain line. And when the British took over New France, frankly, they were a bit terrified of starting to decide inside of the territory of what we call Lower Canada, what was Indigenous land and what wasn't. So they cut it through a place where they felt they could work on, and it was basically close to the Ottawa River, did not include Quebec. That doesn't mean that people here didn't have Indigenous rights, and it doesn't mean that those rights were not respected or were respected.
But the Crown of Britain never recognized those rights here, whereas they did west of the Ottawa River.
Well, yeah, that's probably a good general statement, though. The recognition was, a recognition of convenience, really. So when it was convenient to recognize, it was recognized, and when not, it wasn't. The British felt underneath it all that they owned everything, and that the Indigenous people could stay there because they allowed them to stay there.
Well, that played out in the War of 1812.
Well, the War of 1812, yeah. One of the things that actually pushed me on to do my work was Stephen Harper stating that the Canadians had won the War of 1812. And I thought, okay, I have to look at that. And the War of 1812, we sort of say, well, no one really won, no one really lost, everything was more or less the same. But in fact, the losers were the Indigenous people in the Ohio Valley. And as much as the history talks about the boats and the impressment of the British, of Americans that they could find to put on the boats as basically slaves, the bigger story was that the British, when they signed the American War of Independence, they forgot to invite the Indigenous people to the table. These Indigenous people have been fighting with them as allies. And this is the second time they did it, because they also did it at the war at the end of the
7 years.
the war with France,
7 years war.
the 7 Years' War. So it was all convenience, and it was sort of playing backwards to their audience, really, realizing if it hadn't been for Pontiac and the Ohio Seneca, it never would have been proclamation 1863. It was the only way they could find sort of sue for peace, and they had to, because the Indigenous people were still very powerful. Is that mentioned?
Yeah, well, I think it's a historical anomaly, if you will, that this territory was not covered where we are today. It was actually not covered by the Royal Proclamation.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And in the book, I talk about another aspect of that, and that is the Barrier Lake Algonquin, who are in a territory like this in Quebec, northwest of, I guess, of Manawatu, and they're on unceded land. And after 1990, when both federal and provincial governments were very sensitive and worried about causing any more problems that could result in a second Oka crisis, they were approached by the Barrier Lake Algonquin and said, well, we're on this unceded territory and we want to have a tripartite agreement with you that we will manage it. And we will actually decide where the lumberers can go and where the miners can go. We don't want to stop them. We just want to protect those areas where the moose breed and where the forest maintains itself from. And the French, the Quebec City and Ottawa both accepted this tripartite agreement, and it got underway. And some of the companies were very happy with the arrangement, because now they didn't have to worry about any backlash. Everything was working. Only 12% of the territory was absolutely categorically off limits, so it wasn't bad. The problem was that the Quebec and Ottawa governments suddenly realized that the Barrier Lake territory was technically no longer a part of Canada. In other words, they just didn't have any more jurisdiction over it, and it had a traditional method of choosing its leadership. There was no elections. So what they did in the 2000s is they organized a coup and destroyed their leadership.
I have two online questions. Somebody wants to unmute, I believe, and ask the question themselves.
There was one thing I wanted to mention was that in John Ralston Saul's book, A Fair Country, which probably wasn't as fair as we thought, he mentions there that at the time when the Europeans were coming, the thing that struck the First Nations peoples when they saw them, they thought these people from Europe or from wherever they came, he thought they looked very poor. They were very poorly dressed and they impressed them as being poor. Whereas they, at that time, they had all the clothes and things that they made and had and decorations and everything and food. And these people impressed them as being very, very poor, which is an interesting observation, which nobody else seems to have noticed or commented on.
Yeah, I think both cultures were mystified by the other. Like Cartier saw the people here as being very poor with nothing, the absolute symbol of poverty.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There was a lot of talking across purposes.
The understanding of wealth was different.
That's right.
The second question is a written one. What is the significance of the title?
Okay, thank you for that question.
What is the significance of the title?
Yeah. The title is taken from my realization that effectively the European cultures, the Euro-Christian cultures coming to the Americas were consuming everything in the path. What they saw was the need to acquire property. I don't think that's changed today. I think we are still on a very crucial path to acquiring so much that after a while we won't even own our own bodies because some corporation will own parts of it. But yeah, so I thought, when I compared that to what I was learning about what the Algonquian people thought of the Europeans, they had a foundational myth called the Wendigo. And the Wendigo was a concept that they had to share. They always had to share. Now, when I say share, I mean they share in riches and they share in poverty. And there's a Pueblo who went to Central America. He's current, and he married a Mayan into a Mayan community. And he, in the course of his time there was an earthquake, and he realized that there was another very what's the word? Very secluded Mayan community that had nothing to do with the modern world, and that they would be subject to a disaster as everyone else was because the food was just gone. So he worked very hard to drum up support, playing his guitar in hotels and saving money and try to find a group. And he finally found a group to go in to save these people. And on the way in, they had to go 3 times because they had to feed so many people just to get there. But when they finally crossed the barrier into these people, they were welcomed and they were asked for any food. And he looked around and saw these people starving. And he realized that these people had accepted their fate and were starving together. They felt that their time was over and it was their time to die. So they all just accepted it and they were going to die together. The Wendigo was the concept that some people might break away from that thinking and actually not respect the share. And that was a terrifying concept. The Wendigo was a monster that would eat children and could take people out by themselves in the woods. So they had to have strong stories around the threats of the Wendigo. And after a little while, some of them began calling the Europeans the Wendigo. So you can see the perspective.
I have another online question.
Mhm.
Greg, go ahead.
Oh, hi, Joe. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. And Sheila, nice to see you again. You in the book, you mentioned I think the folks listening in would be interested in you mentioned the statistic that the total decimation of like the estimated population of the indigenous people prior to the arrival of the Europeans, and some figure like 50 years, 100 years later, there's like a tenth, literally they're just wiped out by disease. Do you remember that number somewhere?
Well, the number is 10%.
It is.
Yeah, 10% of the people who survived the diseases.
So there was a 90% wipeout.
Yeah, what it means is that what we were seeing at first was basically refugees from a destroyed culture. And the culture was not destroyed by superior arms. The destruction happened from those diseases that came from those herding cultures that lived with their animals and spread the diseases right across Europe and Asia. Those people in Europe and Asia were all immune to them. And that's why the same colonial tactics did not work in India and China as those tactics did in the New World, because the people didn't die there. They had resistance.
Thank you.
Well, thanks for the question. Can I just interject something? We're honored today to have Dimitri Rossopoulos here. Dimitri Rossopoulos founded Black Rose Books about 51 years ago. Black Rose Books is a nonprofit publisher, and for him to have started that and kept it going is something that we all should be taking our hats off and admiring. His spiritual heir, Clara Swan Kennedy, is also here. And I think, Clara, you're going to be accepting anyone who wants to register for a book purchase today.
Unfortunately, that's true. The books are not available today due to a printing error at the printer. Very important. Unfortunately, we don't have copies of the book today. I just received a message that they'll be ready at 4 o'clock.
we have one.
Joe does have one copy. You'll be able to flip through over here, and if you want to order copies, we're ready to take.
You can order and use my credit card.
Joe should bring his copy here in the front and put it on the table so people can touch it.
Well,